All right. What we need to look at is religious tensions. 4, 5, and 6 are all three religious tensions in New England. 4 is Rhode Island. 5 are the founding of Rhode Island. 5 is the Halfway Covenant, and 6 Salem witch trials. And we're going to look at all three of these together. The religious tensions in New England, Rhode Island first, then Halfway Covenant, and then Salem witch trials. And the reason why, let's go back to our standards. It says describe the settlement of New England, semicolon, include, we went through these things: religious reasons, relations to Native Americans, King Philip's War, we talked about town meetings, and then we get in development of a legislature, and then we get down here to comma, religious tensions that led to the founding of Rhode Island, comma, the Halfway Covenant, comma, Salem witch trials. All three of those are religious tensions. So in this video might be a little bit longer. 4, 5, and 6 are going to be together because we're going to handle all three of them and look at them together as part of a theme. This theme: conflict and religious tension between colonists. Not only between the colonists themselves, but also between the colonists and their government. And if we look at that, we're going to see this tension and conflict between the colonists themselves and their government. You know, a synonymous event that happened in the southern colonies was Bacon's Rebellion. So let's look at the background to these religious tensions. And let's go back and talk about the Puritans for a minute. Puritan beliefs and values. They were mostly, their religion is mostly Calvinist, and then the Calvinist religion was created by John Calvin during the Protestant Reformation. Calvinism has a belief in predestination. Few people, there's only a select few people that are called, and that group is called the elect. And only that small group will receive God's grace and be saved by God. So in predestination, the Puritans had this belief in predestination. Okay, the Puritans were a group that renounced the Church of England and argued that the Church of England was too elaborate in its furnishings and that its rituals, a lot of them, of the church in England was unnecessary. So they were persecuted in England, and so they left and come to the New World. Now when they get here, we see what their mission becomes. On a boat out in the harbor at Plymouth, Governor John Winthrop, the leader of the Puritans, makes a sermon on the boat, and it's called City Upon a Hill. And here's a quote from City Upon a Hill: "For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in the work we shall have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." So they wanted to be a beacon upon a hill to shine out into the world and show them that they were living for God. Okay, so what does this mean? That translate into Puritans holding this strict way of life, this strict moral conduct, and a strict work ethic. You know, you would hear these Puritans tell their children, you know, idle hands of the devil's playground. That's one of the quotes you might hear from the Puritans. And in this City Upon a Hill, the sermon delivered by John Winthrop called on all Puritans in the Puritan community to build a model society, and that was very important for the Puritans. Their mission was to build an ideal Christian society for the whole world to see. As such, in Puritan communities, their community was characterized by an interrelationship between church and state, this relationship between local government and their church. Many of the leaders and elders of the church were often leaders of the local government, some of them even held positions as judges. To show you how serious they were, if you missed church, you had to pay a fine to the local government. and to the church. So church and state are combined in the Puritan community. Alright, so not everybody wanted this same mission. Not everybody wanted to be this strict in their religion. Not everybody wanted that religion. So the Puritan community often, punished severely those people who went against Puritan law, Puritan expectations. The Puritan community expected strict adherence and conformity to the rules of the Puritan church. And they dealt with dissent in different ways. One way was banishment. There were all sorts of other types of torture they would deal with dissent, and we're going to look at one of those in a few moments. So although the Puritans come to New England for religious freedom, they did not tolerate dissent from Puritan laws and requirements. In other words, they didn't accept other religions or other ideas or other rules other than their own. So they were religiously intolerant. So if we look back at these religious tensions that are going to occur, they occur because of the beliefs and ideals of the Puritans and their expectations and their mission of the Puritan community. And the first area of dissent was Rhode Island. The founding of Rhode Island is an example of religious tensions within the New England colonies. A guy by the name of Roger Williams, he is going to challenge the authority of the Puritan church and their local government. He was an activist, and he pushed for the separation of church and state within the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He believed that a person's conscience was not the business of government, that person should be free to worship any way they want to, and that it should be none of the government's business. They should not be punished for not carrying through the faith or attending church. One of the things Roger Williams is attributed to saying is, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. Puritan leaders didn't like this too much, so they banished Roger Williams. He actually fled, but they banished him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, where did Roger Williams go? He went and founded down here this small colony, one of the smallest, and one of the smallest state today, Rhode Island, in 1636. Okay, so here's a different view. Here's Rhode Island. Roger Williams founds Rhode Island, and he establishes Rhode Island. He establishes Rhode Island on the principle of separation of church and state, and he grants religious freedom to all, and freedom to worship regardless of your beliefs in Rhode Island. This is a very early democratic principle that we cherish today, to be here in the United States to freely worship the way we want to. And this wall of separation between church and states that we have today makes sure that our government doesn't force us to do what we want to believe what we don't want to believe. And later on we're going to talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, or changes the Constitution, how we guaranteed that our government could not restrict us from freely worshiping, and that our government could not establish a religion. But Rhode Island and Roger Williams are going to be are examples of these religious tensions within New England. Okay, the second religious tension had to do with the halfway covenant in New England. And let's talk 1 minute about the halfway covenant, and let's move forward. All right. The Puritan church membership was declining. The original first generation Puritans were dying off, getting older. So there was a declining membership in the Puritan church. The second generation and third generation Puritans were more involved, because of prosperous economic activities happening in New England. They were more involved in material wealth issues. In other words, worldly pursuits. They were not really into the original mission of the church. Their zeal for living according to the church was not really as strong as it was in the first generation. And a full membership of the church required that a Puritan in New England devote their entire life to church, and that they give a conversion experience or a born again experience, showing that they had changed and what had brought them to be a zealot for the mission of the church, and that is to do what is godly. And they had to give this full conversion experience to the church and devote their entire life to the church. Not many second and third generation Puritans want to do that. Only full members could baptize their children. Only full members could vote. So these are some of the things full membership requires. So as a result of that, the membership was declining in the church. So the Puritans were forced to make a compromise, a concession. So they offered this halfway covenant within the church, and it allowed for the younger second, third generation Puritans they didn't have to give a conversion experience, but that they could become like half a member, and they could baptize their children in the church. Still couldn't vote, but they could baptize their children in the church, and this was necessary for the Puritan church to survive, and they had to do this to expand church membership. So that's another example of religious tensions in New England. Alright, the third religious tension, Salem witch trials. Alright, Salem witch trials in 1692. There was a series of let's see, there's a series of court hearings and prosecutions within the court in Salem, Massachusetts, and people were being accused of and convicted of being witches, practicing witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts and surrounding areas. 19 people were originally hanged and put to death. One person was pressed, that is, they were larger and larger boulder-sized rocks were put on top of them until they confessed, and one person died because they didn't confess. So all of these prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in a court of law, it really exemplified unsettled social and religious conditions in Massachusetts, and how religion and government mixed together, and a government establishing a religion often ends in disastrous results. And so these, all three of these things, the creation of Rhode Island because Roger Williams was run out of town because he wanted separation of church and state, and then the halfway covenant, the Puritan church had to boost its membership in the church, because the belief of these second, third generation Puritans was waning away. And then Salem witch trials. All three are religious tensions created in New England. The religious tensions in New England: Rhode Island first, then halfway covenant, and then Salem witch trials. And the reason why, let's go back to our standards. It says describe the settlement of New England, semicolon, include, we went through these things: religious reasons, relations to Native Americans, King Philip's War, we talked about town meetings, and then we get in development of a legislature, and then we get down here to this theme: conflict and religious tension between colonists, not only between the colonists themselves, but also between the colonists and their government. And if we look at that, we're going to see this tension and conflict between the colonists themselves and their government. A synonymous event that happened in the southern colonies was Bacon's Rebellion. Religious tensions that led to the founding of Rhode Island, the halfway covenant, Salem witch trials. All three of those are religious tensions. So in this video might be a little bit longer. 4, 5, and 6 are going to be together, because we're going to handle all three of them and look at them together as part of a theme. Alright, what we need to look at is religious tensions. 4, 5, and 6 are all three religious tensions in New England. 4 is Rhode Island, 5 are the founding of Rhode Island, 5 is the halfway covenant, and 6 Salem witch trials. And we're going to look at all three of these together. Let's look at the background to to these religious tensions. And let's go back and talk about the Puritans for a minute. Puritan beliefs and values. They were mostly, their religion was mostly Calvinist, and then the Calvinist religion was created by John Calvin during the Protestant Reformation. Calvinism has